Hello lovelies, today we're taking a look at His Majesty the Worm, which was recently just reprinted, reissued, whatever you want to call it. It's a hardback weighing in at very nearly 400 pages. It's black and white. The art style is somewhat romantic, as in the art style, romantic, rather than anything else. Let me just move my capybara there. Things you should have done before you hit record. Anyway, yes, somewhat romantic in art style and that whole aesthetic. It does have a little ribbon, which we like, obviously. Now, what is His Majesty the Worm? It is an evocatively titled new school game, but with some old school sort of concerns and conceits, thereby either acting as a bridge between sort of new school RPG sentiments, story gaming, that sort of thing, and the old school, or pleasing nobody, depending how cynical you are. I found it interesting from a game design point of view and a focus point of view. Some of you may well find it interesting on the same sort of basis. The other thing that interested me was that it uses tarot cards in order to determine the outcome of actions and so on, and various other mechanics that go on in the game. And I'm always interested in different methods of resolving things. It doesn't use an interpretive sort of wishy-washy way of using the tarot, which is what most games that use the tarot tend to do. Rather, it really primarily uses it just as a random number generator, which is a little bit disappointing, perhaps, to use something so evocative and different to dice and then not to use it to its full potential, unfortunately. Pretty much everything you do has a target number of 14. So what you do is you draw a card, take the numerical value, add your suit strength. Each suit represents different character capabilities. You have ratings in that gives you a bonus, and then you try to get the total over 14, or sometimes over a different number, but mostly 14. You can have favor or disfavor on the roll, which is a flat plus or minus 3, which is kind of the same as advantage or disadvantage in a d20 system, but slightly lower, to give you some kind of gauge. Advantage or disadvantage in d20 games is approximately equal to adding plus 4. It's actually somewhere between 3 and 4, but this has chosen the lower band instead of the higher, which I think, without doing the actual maths, seems to fit better the kind of spread of values you can get from the markings on the tarot cards. Now, if you don't manage to get over 14 on your first card draw, you can attempt to push fate, but only on non-combat tests, and that allows you to draw and add a second card, and if that takes you over 14, great, but if you still fail, that's a botch. So it has a push mechanic similar to, but not equal to, the way in which some other games have push mechanics. I'm thinking primarily of... the name has fallen out of my head right now, but the kind of stuff like Tales from the Loop, Things from the Flood, Year Zero Engine, that's it. It's too early and I should have more caffeine. Right, that encourages you to push constantly, all the time, and if you don't have particularly good odds of success in the Year Zero engine. In this, you have a pretty reasonable chance of success, provided you draw a high enough card and provided you have enough strength in whatever particular suit you're drawing from. So this feels less like it's forcing you to constantly take risks with your character. Plus, it doesn't happen in combat, so yeah, that's okay. System-wise, it is quite abstracted and has a particular emphasis on social play between your characters, despite still being fixated on an old-school dungeon exploring experience. There was a sort of debate trend a few months back about the mythic versus the prosaic dungeon, and this very much leans into a sort of whimsical mythic dungeon that doesn't necessarily have to make sense, but is a place where adventurers can test themselves and find great wealth and magic and all the rest of it. More than a prosaic dungeon, which frees you up to one extent, but I quite like pondering dungeon ecology and things, so it's not necessarily a hit for me, but it may well be for a lot of you. But yeah, there is this emphasis on social interaction between characters. You have relationships with other characters in the group, and you can charge those relationships by role-playing interactions with one another, particularly when your characters are in camp and so on. On the one hand, great, that encourages people to roleplay and so on, which is fantastic. On the other hand, if you've got a group, or even worse, one particular player who isn't particularly invested in the roleplay and is more invested in the dungeon exploration and so on side of things, the combat, stuff like that, then they're going to feel a little bit left out and they're going to miss out on a big portion of the game. So I think you need the right group for this, because if you don't have committed role players, then the players are going to be unable to charge the bonds of their characters, and then you can then spend the bonds that you've charged for various purposes in subsystems. Food and light are important, so you have to kind of manage your resources quite carefully. It's interesting and I think somewhat useful to make a comparison, or to consider this a sort of companion coming from the other direction to Shadow Dark. They come to similar ends from different paths. This coming from the sort of indie story gaming side, Shadow Dark coming from a sort of simplification and making accessible more OSR type mechanics. But a lot of things are quite similar thematically and so on between Shadow Dark and His Majesty the Worm, and they can make quite complementary games to one another. There are even rules in here for converting stuff from OSR to His Majesty the Worm, or potentially the other way, though that's going to be more difficult. So you could potentially use Shadow Dark materials with His Majesty the Worm and vice versa. So I think they make good sort of companion comparison pieces. That's a good way to think about it. This is a little bright for doing reviews, at least once you open the book. Alright, that's a bit better. Play-wise, it also reminds me of a lot of the Japanese RPGs that I've been poking at and reviewing of late. There's a peculiarity of Japanese RPGs that they tend to be very, very tightly and highly structured and procedural in play. Oh, I am going to explore the dungeon. Okay, we go to the dungeon exploring subsystem or subtable. You do 1, 2, 3, 4 in order. We determine the results of that. It can feel quite mechanistic and dry, and it can take you a little bit out of the game to Western eyes, I think. There's something cultural about it, but play-wise, aspects of this remind me a lot of those Japanese RPGs. It is very procedural. It's interesting to observe that we have board gamified D&D and board gamified Pathfinder coming out, and we also have board games that are moving closer towards RPGs. in a lot of ways. And are these going to meet somewhere in the middle? Is this a good idea? Warhammer Fantasy 3rd Edition argues not, perhaps, but so long as it retains the relative cheapness of RPGs, especially in today's market, maybe there's a space for this sort of thing. But I find it frustrating as a role player primarily to have this procedural way of doing things, and I feel like this sort of procedural slant is at odds in tension with the emphasis on roleplay. For me, one of the biggest, most important, unique selling points of RPGs is the ability to do anything and to break out of procedure and ideas and to try stuff and to push the limits and so on. So this procedural, board gamified way of applying systems, to me, foregoes a big part of what makes RPGs so interesting and powerful. They're more freewheeling and lack of structure, but then I'm an anarchist. Anyway, yeah, so it kind of, from my point of view, it suffers a little by being so procedural. You have a crawl phase where you pursue your quest, accumulate wealth, try and avoid hazards, charge your social bonds, move from area to area, room to room. You have tables that the Games Master consults where you check for meat grinder elements, like whether you are into any monsters, as how your torch burns down, all of that kind of thing. That goes along constantly as you go through the crawl phase. When you do run into something bad, that's a challenge phase. I mean bad as in the sense of monsters. So during the challenge phase you fight monsters, you set the scene, you draw cards, you play your initiative cards, which determine not only how quickly you enter into combat, but also how vulnerable you are. So if you hold back and save your action, you're able to protect yourself better, whereas if you overextend yourself and go quick, you make yourself open to attack, which is a pretty neat way of going about it, if you ask me. In combat, unlike regular combat, you draw a hand of cards, like regular play, you draw a hand of cards and you get to choose which cards you use for particular things, and the suit and so on seems to actually matter in that section. In the camping phase you do camp actions, so break bread, eat, rest, tend your wounds, check whether you're going to be interrupted by anything from the dungeon, rest, recover and heal. When you give up on the dungeon, you return to the city. You have a city phase where you pay your taxes. Any noteworthy deeds get recorded and passed around and affect your reputation. There are events and so on in the city. You complete your contracts and missions that you've been given. You upkeep anything that needs upkeeping, and you perform any of your city actions and plan your next dungeon crawl. And this, while all this is going on, the Games Master can obviously restock the underworld that you're going to be facing. A lot is done quasi-randomly, but in setting up the tables for events, etc., the Games Master exerts subtle control and pressure on the way that the game is going to go. You can choose to do a lot of prep and have a proper dungeon with rooms and so on all already laid out, or you could be more improvisational if you wanted. It can go both ways, but the way that the game is laid out is this procedural way of doing things that I'm not entirely sure about. Now, as I said, it uses tarot cards, but I felt that it didn't use them to their full effect, just using them as a random number generator for the most part. The only way the card part really rears its head is in the effect of the Fool as a card, and in having a hand of cards from which you can choose how much effort your character puts into various things. Players use the minor arcana, so the suit cards, plus the Fool. The GMs use the major arcana for their draws. So that's a slight difference, I suppose. managing resources and counting cards is quite useful here, perhaps. Characters that you play are adventurers, members of a guild, which is a loose association of adventurers licensed and foolhardy enough to think that they can go out and plunder dungeons. Characters have attribute scores in terms of their suits. They have their character names. They have their kith and kin, which is a race and a sub-race. They have their own self-defined overriding quest that they're trying to do. Maybe they're questing for the Grail, or to find their lost father, or who disappeared in the dungeon, or whatever else. You have motifs, which are sort of loose categorizations, like skills or specialities. You have bonds with the other characters in the group. You can have animal companions and other resources, such as resolve, lore, and special talents that you can access during play. Characters are defined pretty broadly rather than deeply. You're more likely to gain new capabilities, and you can learn from other characters in your group as well, rather than going to become supremely confident and overwhelmingly powerful in any one particular category. This seems quite good to me because it encourages ongoing caution in play, and in most sort of dungeon crawly fantasy type games, you find that the most effective and evocative and interesting part of the game is those early few levels, maybe 1 to 6 perhaps. So by keeping characters relatively level, it may be unsatisfying for some people, but you can progress your character. It's just they become more broadly experienced and gain capabilities rather than becoming super specialized and overwhelmingly powerful in one particular degree. The races, the kith and kin, include humans from various contesting noble houses, and that's where you differentiate. Noble houses kind of replaces your sub-race, thereby sidestepping a lot of potential problems, I suppose. But there is no such reticence when it comes to the other species. The Fae, there are plenty of different types of elves, but they're more like the elves of fairy than they are Tolkien elves, and that's very much reflected in the way that they're supposed to play, which I quite like. You have Underfolk, which combines all the sort of underground dwelling races, dwarves, trolls, halflings, etc. And you have Orcs, which are basically Vikings. Orcs are somewhat interesting despite being made into a player race, because goblins, which you almost certainly will end up fighting, are juvenile orcs, but they mature and have some intelligence quite early on, so they're up and about and causing mischief almost straight away, and orcs don't treat them like children particularly. If a goblin survives long enough to become an orc, then they're worthy. If they don't, then so what, who cares? You see this reflected in the animal kingdom, and it's an interesting little quirk on orcs, which I found quite interesting, certainly. Paths are careers, so, well, sort of, which include swords, which is warriors, pentacles, which is rogues or skilled individuals, cups, which are traders and scholars, and wands, which are obviously magicians. And most of the rest of the game is about the application of these ideas. The setting is mostly implicit, with bits of explicit setting peeking in. A lot of the game is taken up with ideas and examples, Games Master advice, and so on. I felt like the bestiary was a little bit threadbare. I doubt this is going to be anyone's starter RPG, so while some of the specific GM advice is useful, a lot of it felt like needless sort of repetition, really. It seems odd to me to define so much in a game, which at the same time is simultaneously encouraging and advising you to yeah, it's a little bit odd. Like, it defines a lot of stuff about the city, but then also gives you ideas on making your own. So which is it? That feels a little bit confused as well. Alright, we're almost at the end, so let's consider scores, shall we? Let's reduce all of this effort and artistry and my own personal subjective takes and everything else, and let's figure out a score to give it. Style wise, I like the writing. It is mostly accessible, clear, written well enough. Layout wise, it's fairly clean, readable. I found the referencing of some things somewhat difficult. The index and contents both seemed inadequate. So, for example, during combat, when it's your turn, you seem to be able to use any card of any suit to power your attacks or your capabilities or whatever else. And it's implied, but I couldn't find anywhere where it was explicitly laid out that if you're going to interrupt and do something else to react to someone else's turn, then you have to have something of the correct suit in order to play that card to do so. Which would make sense mechanically and thematically and all the rest of it, but I couldn't find that explicitly said anywhere. I could only find the you can use any card during your turn, which then implies that you can't use any card out of your turn. And the index and the contents were absolutely zero use in finding out whether I was right or not about that, and perhaps my eyes are just glazing over and I'm not seeing it, but it wasn't there on my... I couldn't remember it after my first read through, and then I couldn't reference that anywhere. So maybe that's the case, maybe it isn't. I think it is. It would make sense, and it's implied, but I don't know. So I didn't find the index adequate enough to look around. Art wise, black and white interior art, I don't mind that. I'm a fan. I did, however, find the presentation rather inconsistent. I understand why. It's hard to get the same or similar artists to stick to a consistent style throughout a whole book, especially if you've got 400 pages, needing various illustrations, maps, and everything else that you might need. But it was to the detriment of the book overall, and it just feels a little bit blank. I don't mind that necessarily, but there's vast expanses of negative space throughout the pages, despite being fairly richly illustrated. But for me, it just doesn't land or fully evoke the setting. There are pieces that do more than others, but I was left feeling a little bit kind of at sea when it came to the art direction here. So all things considered, I would give it a fairly high 3 for style. I think it needed to lean more into its visual style to evoke the setting and everything else. The name is great. The actual content is fine, good even, but artistically I felt the presentation in terms of layout and illustrations fell a little bit short for me. There's hints of sort of this Victorian romantic, even sort of Art Nouveau sort of feel to the whole thing, and I really feel like it ought to have lent into that really strongly and consistently throughout the whole book. That would improve it immeasurably, I think. But I appreciate and understand how difficult that can be. Substance wise, it is a complete game. It has lots of advice that you may or may not find useful. It has lots of examples which you may or may not find useful. I can't really fault it in terms of content, except for I felt that the bestiary lacked depth, but there is good guidance on making up your own critters. So substance wise, I would give it a middling 4. So that is 3 for style, 4 for substance. That is 7 out of 10 It's 3.5 out of 5. You could possibly bump it up slightly, because I said a high 3 and a middling 4. So you could almost take it up to the full 4 out of 5. But I'm not entirely sold on that. If you like old school play but new school mechanics, there's a lot to recommend here. I would say it occupies a similar sort of space to Dungeon World, but is better executed, more thoughtful, a much finer book, and does not help Adam Coble, which some of you may well be against due to his assorted shenanigans and so on. So, yeah, interesting. If you're tempted by the new school but you play old school games, or you play old school games and you're tempted by the new school, yeah, definitely worth getting on that basis. And if you're heavily into your Shadow Dark and you want some sort of companion piece for inspiration and other ways to play, then I think there's a lot to recommend this as well. Zang. Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me/JDesborough. Thanks.
Get some plastic surgery against this society. Entropy, morality, totality. Makeup of your final days. Survival of the fittest haze. Might is right on, bite on praise. Smoke and mirrors, twisted maze. Are you strong